The blood was still warm when Ezra Blackwood found it 3 dark drops splattered across granite, like an accusation written in crimson. But it was the shadow moving behind the pine trees, deliberate, predatory, that made his hand drift toward the rifle across his shoulder. Someone was watching him. Ezra froze, every instinct honed by 15 years of frontier survival screaming warnings. The shadow shifted again, and he caught a glimpse of worn leather boots, the kind favored by men who made their living with violence. Professional killers moved differently than amateurs, quieter, more patient, with the confidence that came from knowing they held all the advantages. Attachment is death, boy. His father's voice whispered through the October wind. Care for something and it'll be torn from you. Trust someone and they'll put a knife in your back when you sleep. The wisdom had kept Ezra alive for 15 years, turning him into a ghost who drifted through Montana territory without leaving traces or forming bonds. But the blood on the granite was fresh, maybe minutes old, and somewhere in the wilderness below, someone was running out of time. The scream that shattered the morning quiet made his choice for him. It came from deep in the canyon, raw with pain and defiance, a woman's voice raised in fury rather than surrender. Ezra's rifle was in his hands before the echo died, muscle memory overriding his father's cold philosophy. The shadow behind the trees melted away with professional efficiency, but not before Ezra glimpsed a bearded face marked by smallpox scars. One of Morrison's men, had to be. He found the overturned medical wagon at the canyon's bottom, its contents scattered like shattered dreams across the rocky ground. Bottles of laudanum and carbolic acid caught the morning sun, mixed with torn bandages and surgical instruments that would never save another life. The horses were gone, and the elderly driver lay sprawled beside the front wheel with a bullet hole in his forehead. But it was the woman trapped beneath the wagon's corner that stopped Ezra's breath. She was perhaps 25, with dark hair matted with blood and dirt, wearing the practical dress of someone accustomed to frontier hardships. Her left leg was pinned under the wagon's weight, twisted at an angle that spoke of crushed bone and torn muscle. A small derringer trembled in her grip, trained on his chest with the desperate accuracy of someone who'd already faced death once today. "Stay back," she gasped, her voice hoarse from screaming. "I'll put a bullet in you, I swear it." "Easy," Ezra said, raising his hand slowly. "I'm not here to hurt you. Every man says that." Her eyes blazed with intelligence and fury. "Right before they take what they want, leave you for the crows. What's your name?" "Isabel Reyes." The derringer never wavered. "My father's a doctor. They took him." "Who took him?" "Morrison's animals." The name came out like a curse. "Said they needed medical treatment for someone important. When Papa refused to cooperate willingly, they decided to provide him with proper motivation. Jake Morrison." Ezra knew the reputation, a snake in human form who'd been bleeding Montana territory dry for 2 years. But Morrison had always been careful to avoid high-profile kidnappings that might bring federal attention. Taking a doctor suggested either desperation or orders from someone with serious money and influence. "Your leg's crushed," Ezra observed, studying the angle of her injury. "Without proper treatment, infection will set in within hours. Then I'll die fighting instead of screaming." Isabel's voice carried the kind of steel that impressed even men who'd seen everything the frontier could offer. At least that's a choice. Something cracked inside Ezra's chest, something that had been frozen solid for 15 years. This woman, this Isabel, faced with pain, terror, and almost certain death, was still choosing defiance over surrender. It was exactly the kind of attachment his father had warned against, the kind that got good men killed. But looking into her fierce, dark eyes, Ezra found he didn't care about his father's warnings anymore. "I'm going to lift this wagon," he said, holstering his rifle and moving closer. "When I do, you're going to bite down on something to keep from screaming. Then we're going to get you somewhere safe while we figure out how to find your father." "Now, why would you help me?" Suspicion flickered in Isabel's voice. But the derringer lowered slightly. "You don't know me. Don't owe me anything." It was a fair question, one Ezra couldn't answer without admitting that everything he'd believed about survival was crumbling around him like poorly mortared stone. Instead, he gripped the wagon's edge and lifted muscles straining against dead weight. "Because someone has to," he said simply. The scream that tore from Isabel's throat as the wagon lifted would haunt Ezra's dreams for years to come. But she bit it off with the same iron will that had kept her fighting this long. Her leg was badly damaged, but not broken, the bone intact beneath swollen flesh that would carry scars forever. "There's a cabin," Ezra said as he fashioned a crude splint from wagon debris. "Safe place hidden. We can rest there while you heal and plan our next move." "What about Papa?" "We'll find him." Ezra promised, though he had no idea how to make good on those words. "But first we keep you alive." As he lifted Isabel into his arms, feeling the bird-light weight of her against his chest, Ezra couldn't shake the feeling that this moment was a crossroads. That the choice he was making to care, to get involved, to risk everything for a stranger, would echo through the rest of his life in ways he couldn't imagine. His father's ghost whispered warnings in the wind, but for the first time in 15 years, Ezra didn't listen. Some things he was beginning to understand were worth dying for. The trapper's cabin sat in a fold of land that made it invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Dutch Pete had built it during the fur trade boom when beaver pelts were worth more than gold, and a man's life was measured by his cunning rather than his conscience. Pete had been many things, trapper, smuggler, killer, but he'd also been paranoid enough to build his refuge with multiple escape routes and a hidden crawl space that could hide a man for days. It had saved Dutch Pete's life more than once, right up until his luck ran out in the high country. "How long have you lived alone out here?" Isabel asked as Ezra cleaned her wound with whiskey and torn cloth, her voice tight with pain but steady with curiosity. "Long enough to forget why I started." Ezra replied, not wanting to explain the 15 years of self-imposed exile that had begun with his father's death and hardened into a way of life. "Papa always said the wilderness changes people." Isabel studied his face in the lamplight, searching for something she couldn't name. "Some it makes noble, others it makes savage." "Which are you?" The question hit deeper than any bullet. "I reckon that depends on who's asking. A woman who's betting her life on your answer." "Truth. When was the last time someone had demanded truth from him instead of just directions to the nearest settlement? When was the last time he'd wanted to be worthy of that demand?" "Your father," he said, deflecting while he worked. "What kind of doctor is he?" "The dangerous kind." Pride flickered in Isabel's voice despite her pain. "Papa treats anyone who needs healing, regardless of their ability to pay. Says medicine is a calling, not a business. Makes certain people very angry." "What kind of people?" "Men like Samuel Hartwell. He owns most of Cedar Ridge, the bank, the general store, half the mining claims in the valley. Says Papa's charity work undermines the natural order, encourages laziness among the working classes." Ezra's hands stilled on the bandage. Samuel Hartwell was territory famous, a man who'd grown wealthy on frontier desperation and saw profit in every tragedy. The kind of businessman who could afford to hire professionals when subtler methods failed. "You think Hartwell's behind this?" Papa suspected connections. Isabel's voice was growing heavy with exhaustion and blood loss. Medical supplies disappearing from Hartwell's store, turning up in places they shouldn't. When Papa started documenting the pattern, she trailed off, but Ezra could complete the picture. Dr. Miguel Reyes had gotten too close to something Samuel Hartwell wanted buried, and now both father and daughter were paying the price. "Rest," Ezra said, pulling a blanket over Isabel's shivering form. "I'll keep watch." But as the hours passed and Isabel's breathing settled into the rhythm of exhausted sleep, Ezra found himself facing a choice he'd avoided for 15 years. He could wait for her to heal, escort her to safety, and walk away from whatever trouble was brewing. Or he could stay fight and risk everything for people he barely knew. Outside, a wolf howled in the distance, its voice echoing off canyon walls like a call from another world. Ezra had always understood wolves, solitary hunters, who trusted nothing, who survived by avoiding the attachments that made creatures vulnerable. But watching Isabel sleep, seeing the courage that had brought her this far, Ezra wondered if the wolves had it wrong. Maybe the real cowards were the ones who ran from attachment instead of toward it. The sound of approaching horses 3 days later proved his instincts right. But it was the deliberate pattern of the hoofbeats that made Ezra's blood run cold. Professional reconnaissance, the kind that preceded military-style assault. Isabel. He shook her awake gently but urgently. We have company. She was alert instantly, the kind of awakening that came from too many nights listening for danger. How many? 6 riders spread in a search pattern. They've found our trail. Isabel struggled to sit up, testing her injured leg. The swelling had gone down, but she couldn't put full weight on it yet. I can walk if I have to. You'll have to. Ezra was already moving toward the hidden entrance. Morrison doesn't leave witnesses. The crawl space beneath Dutch Pete's cabin was a testament to frontier paranoia, narrow, damp, and lined with rough timber that caught on clothes and skin. Isabel descended with gritted teeth, her injured leg making every movement agony. This connects to an old mine shaft, Ezra whispered as he followed her down. If we can reach it quietly. The search above began before he could finish the sentence. Boots thundered across the floor, accompanied by the systematic destruction of everything Dutch Pete had left behind. These weren't Morrison's usual rough-dressed bandits. These men moved with military precision. Fresh blood on the floor, a gravelly voice announced. Morrison himself close enough that Ezra could hear every word clearly. Someone's been tending wounds. They're here, or they were recently. I could have moved on, another voice suggested. Trail goes cold about a mile from here. Jake Morrison didn't build his reputation by accepting convenient explanations. Morrison replied coldly. Tear this place apart. Check everything twice. Beside him in the cramped space, Isabel was fighting waves of fever and pain. The stress of hiding was pushing her injured body beyond its limits, and Ezra could feel her trembling against his side like a wounded bird. The hunt above continued with methodical brutality. Furniture crashed, wood splintered, and metal clanged as Morrison's men destroyed everything in their search for hidden compartments or secret passages. Ezra counted at least 6 distinct voices, all speaking with the casual professionalism of men who killed for money. Then blessed silence. Now they're gone, Morrison announced finally. Whoever they were, they're wolf bait by now. Cold and wolves don't leave much for the morning. The departure was as organized as the search, but Ezra remained motionless until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely. Only then did he help Isabel climb back into the destroyed cabin. They'll be back, she said, surveying the wreckage with grim acceptance. When they don't find bodies, they'll know we escaped. Then we move now, Ezra agreed. There's something I need to show you first. Among Dutch Pete's scattered possessions, Ezra found what he was looking for, a leather journal wrapped in oilcloth, hidden in a cavity behind the fireplace. The pages contained detailed records of smuggling operations, including names, dates, and financial transactions that painted a clear picture of corruption. Pete kept records of everyone he dealt with, Ezra explained as Isabel scanned the entries, including Samuel Hartwell. Look at this. Isabel's finger traced a series of payments. Regular deliveries to JM has to be Jake Morrison, but the orders came through territorial government channels signed by officials in Helena. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just local corruption, it was a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of territorial government, with Morrison's gang serving as the violent enforcement arm of men who preferred to keep their hands clean. We need to get this to Marshal Carson, Isabel said. If Carson's clean, Ezra replied grimly. For all we know, he's part of it too. But even as he said it, Ezra knew they had no choice. The evidence in Dutch Pete's journal was their only chance to expose the conspiracy before it destroyed them all. They would have to trust someone eventually. The question was whether that trust would get them killed. They found Dr. Miguel Reyes chained in a limestone cave that reeked of old blood and older secrets beaten, but alive, his gentle eyes blazing with unbroken defiance. The cave itself was a monument to frontier brutality, bones scattered in dark corners, rusted manacles bolted to stone walls, evidence of atrocities that predated Morrison's occupation. Isabel, Dr. Reyes whispered, when he saw his daughter limping toward him, supported by Ezra's strong arm. Mia, I thought they'd killed you. Not yet, Papa. Isabel knelt beside her father despite the pain in her leg, her hands checking his injuries with practiced efficiency. But we need to move quickly. Morrison's men are hunting us. Dr. Miguel Reyes was smaller than Ezra had expected, a man in his 50s with graying hair and hands marked by years of healing work. But there was steel in him, the quiet strength that came from facing down death regularly and refusing to surrender to it. They wanted me to treat someone, he said as Ezra worked to free his chains. Someone important, someone with political connections. When I refused to cooperate without knowing who, they decided to provide proper motivation. Who did they want you to treat? Ezra asked. They wouldn't say, but it was someone powerful enough to make Morrison nervous. He kept mentioning the territorial contract and how this job would secure their future operations. Dr. Reyes paused his eyes, focusing on Ezra with sudden intensity. There was something else. One of Morrison's men had a fresh bullet wound, said he got it from that bastard deputy in Cedar Ridge who thinks he's too good for honest graft. Ezra felt ice form in his stomach. Deputy Morrison? That's what they called him. Tom Morrison. Apparently Jake's younger brother working inside the marshal's office. The wounded man seemed to think Tom was getting too ambitious, forgetting which side paid his salary. The revelation hit like a physical blow. If Tom Morrison was feeding information to his brother's gang, then walking into Cedar Ridge might be like walking into a trap. And if Marshal Carson was clean, he was probably already dead. We have to warn Carson, Isabel said, reading Ezra's thoughts. First, we get your father to safety, Ezra replied. Then we deal with Cedar Ridge. But even as he said it, Ezra knew they were already committed to a course that would end in blood. The only question was whose. The journey toward town took them through country Ezra knew intimately, the same wilderness where he'd spent 15 years avoiding human contact. Now he moved through it with purpose, following trails that would bring them within sight of Cedar Ridge without exposing them to Morrison's patrols. There's something you should know, Dr. Reyes said as they rested beside a mountain stream. About why Hartwell wants me dead specifically. What do you mean? Isabel asked. 3 years ago, I treated a man with a gunshot wound. Professional job, the kind that speaks to serious money-changing hands. The man was delirious with fever, talking about shipments and contracts, mentioning Hartwell's name repeatedly. What did he say? Ezra asked, though he suspected he already knew. That Hartwell was planning something big, something that would clear out the competition and secure exclusive mining rights throughout the territory. The man died before he could say more, but I wrote down everything I could remember. You still have those notes? Hidden in Cedar Ridge. If we can retrieve them. Dr. Reyes didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Those notes combined with Dutch Pete's journal might be enough to expose the entire conspiracy. But retrieving them would mean walking into the heart of enemy territory, where Tom Morrison had the authority of a badge and the knowledge of an insider. As they approached the ridge overlooking Cedar Ridge, Ezra could see smoke rising from chimneys and people going about their daily business. The town looked peaceful from a distance, but appearances were often deceiving on the frontier. Something's wrong, Isabel said, studying the scene below. Look at the marshal's office. Ezra followed her gaze and saw what had caught her attention. A crowd had gathered in front of the building, but their posture spoke of anger rather than curiosity. Even from this distance, he could see weapons being displayed openly, the kind of preparation that preceded vigilante justice. And standing at the center of the crowd, gesticulating wildly and clearly working the mob into a frenzy, was a well-dressed man, with silver hair and the soft hands of someone who'd never known honest work. Samuel Hartwell was giving a speech, and the crowd was responding with the enthusiasm of people who'd found someone to blame for their troubles. "We can't go down there," Dr. Reyes said quietly. "Hartwell's turned them against you, Ezra. They'll lynch you before you can speak a word in your defense. Then we find another way." Ezra replied, but his mind was already working through the tactical problems. Cedar Ridge had only one main street, and Hartwell's crowd controlled it completely. Any approach would be seen and intercepted. "There might be a way," Isabel said slowly. "The old Chinese quarter on the east side of town. Papa treats people there regularly. They trust him. If we could reach them..." It was a desperate plan, but desperation was all they had left. The Chinese immigrants lived in a section of town that most whites avoided, making it the closest thing to neutral territory Cedar Ridge offered. "Can you make it that far?" Ezra asked Isabel, noting the strain around her eyes. "I'll make it," she replied with the same iron will that had impressed him from their first meeting. "The question is whether Mrs. Chen will risk her family's safety to help us." As they began their careful descent toward the outskirts of Cedar Ridge, Ezra couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something much larger than a simple territorial conspiracy. The crowd around Hartwell moved with the kind of organized purpose that suggested careful planning and outside coordination. This wasn't just about greed or local corruption. This was about power, and the men who wielded it were prepared to kill anyone who threatened their carefully constructed empire. But looking at Isabel's determined face, at her father's quiet courage, Ezra found that he didn't care about the odds anymore. Some things were worth fighting for regardless of the cost, and sometimes the only way to win a rigged game was to change the rules entirely. Mrs. Chen's laundry occupied a narrow building at the edge of Cedar Ridge's Chinese quarter. Its windows steamed, and its yard hung with clothes that spoke of hard work and honest living. The elderly woman who answered their soft knock studied them with dark eyes that had seen too much of frontier hatred to trust easily. "Dr. Reyes," she said finally, her English accented but precise. "You come at dangerous time. We need help, Mrs. Chen." Dr. Reyes replied gently. "And we can offer something in return, a chance to make Cedar Ridge safer for everyone." She studied them for a long moment, taking in Isabel's obvious injuries, Ezra's weapons, and the desperate urgency that surrounded them like smoke. Finally, she stepped aside. "Come, quickly." The interior of the laundry was warm and humid, filled with the smells of soap and honest sweat. Mrs. Chen led them through the work area to a small living space where her teenage son sat reading from a book that looked suspiciously like a medical text. "David, these people need help," she said in rapid Chinese, then switched back to English. "My son, he's studied to be doctor like you. Want to help people, but..." She gestured toward the window, where the sound of Hartwell's crowd could be heard clearly. "What's Hartwell been telling them?" Ezra asked. "That you are killer." Mrs. Chen replied bluntly. "That you murder innocent travelers, kidnap doctor and daughter. Says you come to town tonight, that good citizens must be ready to defend themselves." "It's all lies," Isabel said urgently. "We're trying to expose the real criminals, the ones who've been terrorizing this territory for years." Mrs. Chen studied Isabel's face with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to read truth in dangerous circumstances. "Show me," she said finally. Dr. Reyes retrieved his hidden notes from their concealment behind a loose brick in Mrs. Chen's fireplace. Apparently, he'd been using the Chinese Quarter as a safe house for months. Combined with Dutch Pete's journal, the evidence painted a clear picture of systematic corruption and violence. "This Morrison gang," Mrs. Chen said after examining the documents. "They killed my husband's brother last spring. Make it look like mining accident, but we know better." "Why didn't you report it?" Ezra asked. Mrs. Chen's laugh was bitter. "Report to who? Deputy Morrison. He already know what happened, probably helped plan it." The confirmation of Tom Morrison's involvement sent ice through Ezra's veins. If the deputy was actively participating in his brother's crimes, then Marshal Carson was either corrupt or already dead. "We need to get this evidence to territorial authorities," Dr. Reyes said. "Someone above the local corruption." "First, we need to survive the night," Ezra corrected. "Hartwell's crowd is working up the courage to come looking for us, and when they do..." He was interrupted by the sound of boots on the front porch, followed by a polite but firm knock. Mrs. Chen moved to the window and peered out, her face going pale. "Marshal Carson," she announced. "Alone?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Was Carson clean, or was this the moment their luck finally ran out? "Let him in," Ezra said, drawing his pistol but keeping it low. "But be ready to run if this goes wrong." Wade Carson entered the laundry like a man walking into church, respectfully, but with the kind of controlled alertness that had kept him alive through 30 years of frontier law enforcement. He was tall and lean, with iron-gray hair and the weathered face of someone who'd seen everything the territory could offer and remained unimpressed by most of it. "Dr. Reyes," he said, touching his hat brim. "Miss Reyes, Mr. Blackwood." His eyes found Ezra's weapon and dismissed it with professional calm. "Mind if we talk?" "Depends on what you want to talk about," Ezra replied, not holstering his gun. "Well, I could start with the fact that Tom Morrison tried to kill me about an hour ago," Carson said conversationally. "Shot me in the back as I was walking to investigate reports of trouble at the clinic. Fortunately, Tom always was a poor shot when he got nervous." The marshal turned slightly, showing them the blood stain on his shirt and the crude bandage beneath. "Or we could discuss the interesting documents I found in Tom's desk after I arrested him. Financial records, correspondence orders from people who shouldn't be giving orders to deputy marshals." "Tom's arrested?" Isabel asked. "Tom's dead," Carson corrected grimly. "Tried to draw on me while he was in custody. I gave him every chance to surrender, but he chose the hard way." The marshal's eyes hardened. "Just like his brother will when I catch up to him." Ezra finally holstered his weapon, reading truth in Carson's voice and manner. "What about Hartwell's crowd?" "Disperse them with a few hard truths about who they were really working for," Carson replied. "Turns out most folks don't like being used as cat's paws for territorial politicians. But that's just buying us time." "What do you mean?" "I mean, Samuel Hartwell has friends in Helena who aren't going to let a little thing like truth and justice interfere with their profits. There's probably a company of territorial militia riding this way right now with orders to restore order by any means necessary." The implications were chilling. If territorial forces were involved, then the conspiracy reached higher than any of them had imagined. Local law enforcement would be powerless against military authority, and anyone who could connect the dots would be eliminated under the guise of maintaining public safety. "How long do we have?" Dr. Reyes asked. "Maybe 12 hours if we're lucky," Carson replied. "Question is, what do we do with the time?" It was Ezra who provided the answer, his mind working through possibilities with the clarity that came from years of survival thinking. "We make sure the truth can't be buried with us," he said. "Even if they kill everyone in this room, the evidence needs to survive." "How do we do that?" Isabel asked. "We make copies," Ezra said simply. "Lots of copies. Send them to every newspaper in the territory, every federal marshal, every territorial representative who might still have a conscience." "And then?" Carson asked. "Then we make our stand." Ezra replied, his voice carrying the calm certainty of a man who'd found something worth dying for. Right here in Cedar Ridge, where it all started. The night that followed would be remembered in territorial history as the beginning of the Cedar Ridge War, though it started quietly enough with the soft scratch of pens on paper and the whispered conversations of people who knew they were running out of time. Mrs. Chen and her son worked with Dr. Reyes to create multiple copies of the evidence, while Isabel helped despite her injured leg, and Carson organized the town's defenses. Ezra found himself moving between tasks, coordinating a resistance that grew larger as word spread through Cedar Ridge's back streets and hidden corners. The Chinese Quarter became the heart of the operation, its narrow streets and close-built buildings offering natural choke points for defense. But it was the people who made the real difference. Immigrants who'd been terrorized by Morrison's gang for years. Miners who'd lost friends to accidents that benefited Hartwell's mining claims. Storekeepers who'd been forced to buy protection from the very criminals who threatened them. By midnight, Cedar Ridge had transformed from a frightened town into an armed camp with ordinary citizens ready to fight for the right to live without fear. Never seen anything like it, Carson admitted as he and Ezra surveyed their improvised fortifications. Usually folks run when the shooting starts. These people are running toward the fight. They're tired of being victims, Ezra replied. Sometimes that's all it takes. But even as he said it, Ezra knew the coming battle would test everyone's courage. Professional soldiers were different from territorial bandits, and the men riding toward Cedar Ridge would be equipped and trained for exactly this kind of operation. The attack came at dawn, preceded by the thunder of horses and the snap of military standards in the morning wind. But it wasn't the territorial militia Ezra had expected. It was Morrison's gang reinforced with hired professionals and moving with the desperate fury of men who knew their world was ending. They're making their last play, Carson observed, watching the riders spread out along the hills surrounding the town. Kill everyone who knows the truth, burn the evidence, and disappear into the wilderness. How many? Isabel asked from her position behind an overturned wagon. There are 30, maybe more, Ezra replied, studying the attacking force through field glasses. But they're not coordinating properly. Desperation makes men sloppy. The first shots came from the north, where Morrison's men tried to force their way through the main street. But Cedar Ridge's defenders were ready, and the attackers found themselves facing concentrated fire from buildings, alleys, and improvised barricades. The battle that followed was unlike anything the Montana Territory had ever seen, not the usual frontier gunfight between individuals, but a coordinated military action involving an entire community fighting for its survival. Isabel proved her worth early, using her medical training to keep wounded defenders in the fight, while also coordinating ammunition distribution from her central position. Dr. Reyes moved between casualty stations with calm efficiency, treating injuries with the same compassionate skill he'd always shown. But it was Mrs. Chen who provided the tactical innovation that turned the tide. Working with her son and other Chinese immigrants, she created a network of rooftop observers and runners who could track enemy movements and coordinate defensive responses faster than the attackers could adapt. Morrison's trying to flank us from the east. David Chen reported having sprinted across 3 blocks under fire to deliver the information. About 12 men moving through the old mining claims. Mrs. Chen, Ezra called out, "Can your people slow them down? We can do better than that." She replied with a smile that was absolutely terrifying. "My husband was mining engineer before he died. We know exactly where to place explosives for maximum effect." The explosion that followed shook the entire valley, bringing down half a hillside and trapping Morrison's flanking force in a narrow defile, where they became easy targets for the town's marksmen. But the real victory came when the sound of the blast carried across the territory, alerting everyone within 50 miles that something significant was happening in Cedar Ridge. "New help's coming," Carson announced, pointing toward dust clouds on the southern horizon. Looks like federal marshals and maybe some territorial cavalry that's still clean. The tide of battle turned quickly after that. Morrison's gang caught between the town's defenders, and approaching federal forces began to break apart as individual gunmen decided that survival was more important than loyalty. But Jake Morrison himself wasn't finished yet. The bandit leader appeared on Main Street like an avenging ghost, his clothes torn and bloody, but his eyes blazing with the fury of a man who'd lost everything. He walked straight down the middle of the street, his guns drawn, and his voice carrying clearly over the diminishing gunfire. "Ezra Blackwood," he shouted. "This is between you and me. Come out and face me, or I start killing townspeople one by one." It was the classic frontier challenge, the kind of dramatic confrontation that belonged in dime novels rather than real life. But Morrison was serious, and he had the weapons and desperation to make good on his threat. "Don't do it," Isabel called out from her position. "It's suicide." "Maybe." Ezra agreed, checking his weapons and stepping into the street. "But it's also the only way this ends." The confrontation that followed was brief, brutal, and decisive. Morrison was faster than Ezra had expected, but desperation made him careless. His first shot went wide, splintering wood from a storefront, while Ezra's reply found its mark with the accuracy that had kept him alive for 15 years. Jake Morrison dropped to his knees in the dust of Main Street, his guns falling from nerveless fingers. "You don't understand," he gasped, blood flecking his lips. "This is bigger than all of us. Hartwell, the territorial governor. They'll never stop. Too much money at stake." "Maybe," Ezra replied, standing over the dying bandit. "But they'll have to find someone else to do their killing." Morrison's eyes went glassy, fixed on something in the distance that only he could see. His last words were barely audible. "Should have stayed in the mountains, Blackwood. Should have minded your own business." As the echoes of gunfire faded and federal marshals rode into Cedar Ridge to restore order, Ezra found himself thinking about Morrison's final warning. Maybe the bandit had been right. Maybe he should have stayed isolated in the wilderness, avoiding the attachments that had brought him to this moment. But looking at Isabel's relieved smile, at her father's quiet satisfaction, at the faces of people who were finally free to live without fear, Ezra knew he'd made the right choice. Some things were worth fighting for, even when the fight changed everything you thought you knew about yourself. The trials that followed the Battle of Cedar Ridge made headlines across the territory and beyond, with newspapers calling it the Montana Conspiracy, and editorializing about the need for honest government in America's frontier regions. Samuel Hartwell was the first to face justice, his expensive clothes and political connections useless in the face of overwhelming evidence. "Mr. Hartwell," the territorial judge said during sentencing, "you stand convicted of conspiracy murder and treason against the territorial government. The court sentences you to hang by the neck until dead sentence to be carried out at the earliest possible convenience." Hartwell's face went white, but he rallied with the arrogance that had sustained him through years of criminal activity. "You're making a mistake, Your Honor. I have friends in Washington, powerful friends, who won't let this stand. Your friends in Washington are currently under federal investigation," the judge replied coldly. "And several of them are likely to join you on the gallows before this is over." The territorial governor was next brought down by his own correspondence and the testimony of federal investigators who'd been building a case against him for months. It turned out that Cedar Ridge wasn't the only place where mysterious bandit attacks had been clearing the way for government land grabs and mineral rights transfers. But for Ezra, the most satisfying moment came when the federal court awarded significant financial compensation to the families of Morrison's victims, including a substantial sum that Mrs. Chen used to open a proper school for the Chinese children of Cedar Ridge. "Justice," Dr. Reyes observed as they watched the new school's construction, "isn't just about punishment. It's about making sure the future is better than the past." Speaking of the future, Isabel said, her hand finding Ezra's as they stood together in the evening light. What happens to us now? It was a question Ezra had been avoiding, one that forced him to confront feelings he'd spent 15 years running from. What did happen to a man who chose an attachment over isolation, who discovered that caring for someone was worth any risk? I was thinking, he said carefully, that Cedar Ridge could use a sheriff. Someone to work with the federal marshals, help keep the peace while the territory rebuilds. Are you asking me to stay? I'm asking you to marry me. Ezra said the words coming out in a rush that surprised them both. I know I'm not much of a catch, a broken-down gunfighter with more scars than sense. But I love you, Isabel. I love you enough to risk everything, including my heart. Her kiss was answer enough, soft and warm and full of promises that neither of them had dared to make before. When they finally broke apart, Isabel was smiling through tears. Yes, she whispered. Yes to all of it. Marriage, staying, building something together, but on one condition. What's that? No more running away when things get difficult. No more protecting me by pushing me away. We face whatever comes next together, or we don't face it at all. It was exactly the kind of attachment his father had warned him against, the kind of vulnerability that could destroy a man if he wasn't careful. But looking into Isabel's eyes, seeing the strength and love that had brought them through so much darkness, Ezra realized his father had been wrong about one crucial thing. Attachment wasn't death. It was life, messy, complicated, dangerous, and absolutely worth every risk. Together, he agreed, sealing the promise with another kiss as the Montana sky painted itself in shades of gold and crimson. The wedding took place 6 months later in the new church of Cedar Ridge that had been built with donations from grateful families throughout the territory. Dr. Reyes performed the ceremony, having been ordained as a minister during his medical training, and it seemed like half of Montana territory showed up to witness the union. Marshal Carson stood as Ezra's best man, his weathered face showing uncharacteristic emotion as he watched his friend take vows that would have been unthinkable just a year before. Mrs. Chen and her son David sat in the front row, representing the immigrant community that had found hope and acceptance in the new Cedar Ridge. Even Murphy, the old Irish miner who'd helped turn the tide in the final battle, was there with tears in his eyes. Never thought I'd see the day, he whispered to his wife. That boy was wound tighter than a watch spring when he first came to town. Look at him now. But for Ezra, the most important moment came not during the ceremony itself, but afterward, as he and Isabel stood on the porch of their new home, the expanded clinic that would serve as both medical facility and sheriff's office. Any regrets? Isabel asked, her hand resting in his, as they watched their wedding guests celebrating in the street below. Ezra thought about the question seriously, as he did all her questions. In the months since the Battle of Cedar Ridge, there had been other challenges, other threats to face. Corrupt officials still tried to line their pockets with public money, bandits still raided isolated settlements, and the harsh Montana winter still claimed lives every year. But there had also been moments of joy that his younger self could never have imagined. The successful treatment of a cholera outbreak that could have devastated the territory. The birth of Tom Fletcher's daughter named Isabel, in honor of the woman who'd helped save her father's life. The simple pleasure of waking up each morning next to someone who'd chosen to share his life despite knowing all his scars and shadows. No, he said finally. I don't regret it. Not any of it. Even the pain. Especially the pain, Ezra replied. Maybe pain is the proof we cared enough to risk everything. As if summoned by his words, a small figure came running around the corner of the house, Tommy Fletcher, now 7 years old, and convinced that Sheriff Blackwood was the greatest hero who'd ever lived. The boy had been visiting Dr. Reyes for treatment of a childhood illness, and he'd apparently escaped his mother's supervision to seek out his favorite target for questions about the old days, Sheriff Ezra. Tommy called, using the title with obvious pride. Mama says you used to live all alone in the mountains. Is that true? It is. Ezra replied, kneeling down to the boy's level. For a very long time. Weren't you lonely? The question asked with the innocent directness of childhood hit harder than any bullet Ezra had ever taken. He glanced up at Isabel, seeing understanding and sympathy in her dark eyes. Yes, he said honestly. I was very lonely. But I didn't know how lonely until I found people worth being unlonely for. Tommy considered this with the seriousness of a philosopher. And now you're not lonely anymore. Now I'm not lonely anymore, Ezra confirmed. Good, Tommy said with satisfaction. Lonely people are sad, and heroes shouldn't be sad. As the boy ran back toward his family, Ezra felt Isabel's hand squeeze his. Out of the mouths of babes, she said softly. Indeed, Ezra agreed. The years that followed brought their share of challenges and changes. Isabel and Ezra's first child was born during a blizzard that trapped Dr. Reyes in his clinic for 3 days, forcing Ezra to deliver his own daughter with hands that were better suited to handling guns than babies. Their son came 2 years later during the spring flood that turned Main Street into a river and made every building in town an island. The Chinese immigrants who'd been driven out by previous administrations flourished under the new order, bringing with them the kind of hard work and community spirit that made frontier towns thrive. David Chen became the territory's first Chinese-American doctor, working alongside Dr. Reyes to establish medical schools throughout Montana. Mrs. Chen lived to see her grandson graduate from the Territorial University, an institution that existed partly because of the educational trust fund she'd established with money from her successful laundry and import business. Her legacy lived on in every child who learned to read, despite the prejudices of their parents, every family that found acceptance in a place that had once been defined by fear and hatred. Marshall Carson eventually retired, turning over his badge to a younger man, but staying in Cedar Ridge as an unofficial advisor to Sheriff Blackwood. The transition was smooth, largely because everyone in the territory knew that Ezra was the kind of lawman who cared more about justice than politics, more about protecting people than protecting his own reputation. Dr. Reyes lived to see his grandchildren carry on his medical legacy, establishing clinics and hospitals throughout the growing territory. His philosophy of healing that medicine was a calling rather than a business, became the standard for frontier medical practice, influencing generations of doctors who followed in his footsteps. But it was on a warm summer evening, 20 years after that first meeting in the wilderness, that Ezra truly understood how much his life had changed. He was sitting on his porch watching his teenage children play with their friends, while Isabel prepared dinner in the kitchen behind him. The sounds of family life, laughter, conversation, the comfortable domesticity of people who belonged together, filled the evening air like music he'd never thought he'd be privileged to hear. A rider appeared at the end of the street, moving slowly and carefully, as if uncertain of his welcome. As the figure got closer, Ezra could see it was a young man, maybe 18, with the kind of hollow-eyed look that came from too much running and not enough hope. Sheriff Blackwood, the young man called out, dismounting near the porch. I'm looking for Sheriff Blackwood. You found him, Ezra replied, studying the newcomer with the careful attention that had kept him alive through decades of frontier violence. What can I do for you? My name's James Chen. Mrs. Chen was my great-aunt. I got word that this might be a place where someone like me could find help. Ezra smiled, understanding immediately. Word had spread throughout the territory, and beyond that, Cedar Ridge was different, that it was a place where people were judged by their actions rather than their appearance, where justice meant something more than money and political connections. Depends on what kind of help you need, Ezra said, gesturing for the young man to sit down. But I reckon we can find something. As James Chen began to tell his story, persecution violence, the same kind of systematic oppression that had driven his family from place to place. Ezra felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. There would be another fight, another chance to choose between safety and justice. But this time he wasn't facing it alone. Isabel appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron and studying their visitor with the kind of compassionate attention that had first drawn Ezra to her all those years ago. Behind her, their children peeked out curiously, already learning that their home was a place where strangers could find sanctuary. "There's always room at our table," Isabel said simply, and Ezra knew that once again they would find a way to make things right. The bravest souls don't shoot fastest, he'd learned over the years. They're the ones who risk everything for strangers. And if justice meant choosing mercy when the world screamed for revenge, then Ezra Blackwood was proud to be called a fool forever. As the sun set behind the Montana mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Ezra Blackwood sat surrounded by the family he'd never expected to have in the community he'd helped to build facing the future, with the same courage that had brought him through the darkness of his past. Real love, he discovered, was when you stayed, especially when every scar told you to run. But more than that, real love was building something that would outlast your own life, something that would make the world a little better for the people who came after. The child who appeared at the end of the street the next morning, a Lakota girl, maybe 12 years old, carrying a bundle and walking with the determined stride of someone who traveled far to find hope, was just the beginning. Cedar Ridge had become something unprecedented in the Montana Territory, a place where outcasts became citizens, where strangers became family, where the American dream of equality and justice was more than just words written on paper. And at the heart of it all was a man who'd once believed that attachment was death, but had learned the most important lesson of his life. Sometimes attachment was the only thing that made life worth living. That real love is when you stay, especially when every scar tells you to run. Ezra had told Isabel on their wedding day. "The bravest souls don't shoot fastest. They're the ones who risk everything for strangers," she'd replied. "If justice means choosing mercy when the world screams for revenge, then call me a fool forever," they'd said together. And in the growing light of a Montana morning, with his wife beside him, and their community stretching toward a future built on hope rather than fear, Ezra Blackwood knew that all the pain, all the risk, all the attachment that had once terrified him had been worth it. He was no longer the isolated ghost who'd haunted the wilderness for 15 years. He was a husband, a father, a sheriff, a friend, a man who'd learned that the greatest courage wasn't in facing death alone, but in choosing to live surrounded by people you'd risk everything to protect. And in Cedar Ridge, Montana, in the year 1882, that was enough to change the world.